So hello and thank you for joining us for this live broadcast this evening. My name is Gloria Guidu. This presentation format is an exciting next step for Caritas. And in case any of you don't yet know, we've changed our name. The Caritas Center has become Caritas Consciousness Project. Still Caritas for short, however. Our new name reflects more clearly what we're about, and which is the evolution of consciousness individually and collectively. The programs that we select, whether addressing healing, paranormal experiences and activities, spiritual exploration, or science, are all in the service of increasing our understanding of our true nature and our role in the unfoldment of our collective destiny. To this end, tonight's presentation is superbly fitted. We're delighted to have Dr. Claude Swanson here with us again. Dr. Swanson was educated as a physicist at MIT and Princeton University. For more than 25 years, interspersed with his conventional professional career in applied physics, Dr. Swanson has pursued investigations into unconventional physics. His principal interest has been unified field theory, the so-called theory of everything, which could explain the universe at the deepest possible level. This has led him to investigate many aspects of the paranormal, which appear to be completely real phenomena that violate our present science. Paranormal phenomena, which have now been proven in the laboratory in many cases, offer a window into the deeper universe, the mysteries of consciousness, and unlock new forces and principles which conventional science has only begun to glimpse. Dr. Swanson likes to address questions at the end of his presentations. However, you can type in your question at any time by clicking the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now let me give you Claude Swanson.
This is my introduction. Gloria has been holding my hand and working me through this whole system with Zoom today, so we can do this, and hopefully she'll interrupt if I start doing anything stupid or crazy. But it's delightful to be in contact with all of you again. I saw quite a few of you in Boulder a few months ago, and so it's fun to do this new format. I'm down in Tucson today, so if this works out well, and it seems to, then hopefully we can do this more often. This is the first of a number of chapters in my new book, Science of the Soul, Afterlife, and the Shift. And I'll do the introduction today, and as time goes on, we will go to the subsequent chapters. So background, you know what my background is probably. Most of you do, as Gloria just mentioned. Educated as a physicist, and as I mentioned in my talks, I guess in the 1980s, I discovered that they left out a few things in physics, things that are not taught as part of mainstream physics, and yet they are well-observed phenomena, and they all have to do with consciousness one way or the other. I learned that our military does remote viewing, which means that they have techniques to enable the consciousness to go out of body and travel thousands of miles and visit other laboratories or other projects or other people halfway around the world inside closed rooms, things like that. They can even read documents. So this is impossible based on our current physics, and yet people do it. So that's just one of the many ways that consciousness defies what we understand in present physics today. 100 years ago, the founders of quantum physics realized that consciousness is a powerful force that needs to be included in physics, and yet somehow in mainstream physics it's been neglected and overlooked even to this day. My suspicion is that probably there are secret programs in which this stuff is very well developed, but for those of us on the outside, we have to kind of follow along and figure out things as best we can. I think that physics is going to eventually have to undergo a deep revolution as it integrates this power of consciousness and of physics with the other forces that we know about. When we do, we will come to understand that the soul is a very real energy. In one of my last book, I talked about the special energy that makes up the soul, and in the most recent book, Synchronized, I talk about how the soul is actually formed from torsion energy, which is the part that's left out of conventional physics. So there's 3 books that I've written so far. As you probably know, Synchronized Universe was the first one, and I've gotten very good reviews on that book. It's a relatively short book. It's only 350 pages. My second book, Life Force, about 800 pages, a much bigger book, all about this torsion energy and the nature of consciousness, what is missing from our present physics, and how healers use this energy to do healing even at long range, or exerting it over distances and over time. And it's been called a tour de force by Professor Rustum Roy, Penn State. Elmer Green, the founder of Einstein, called my book One for the Ages. So it's kind of a Bible for understanding this torsion force. And then it has a lot of references, lots of figures and graphs to explain what this energy is like. Mostly, it was developed in Russia in the 1950s, and it has not received very much attention or explanation in Western countries. So my book tries to put as much of the scientific understanding as possible into this important energy. They've been used as college textbooks, and hopefully will go a long way toward one day having physics start to enlarge itself and cover these forces to a larger audience. The most recent book, Science of the Soul, the Afterlife, and the Shift, looks at the next step, which is, what is the soul? Do we have an afterlife? Is it real? And what happens when we die? And what I discovered, which many people have known before, is that there are higher planes of consciousness. We have our normal everyday consciousness we use in functioning, driving, shopping, doing our taxes, things like that, normal consciousness. But there are higher planes. The yogis, the great mystics, access these planes. We all can access these higher levels, and they're all a natural part of who we are. When we're in the afterlife, we tend to drop that lower consciousness level that we use in the physical world, and we spend our time in the higher planes where our everyday life becomes occupied with different activities there. And I studied lots of different examples and much data to learn what the afterlife is like and what the evidence is for the existence of the soul, and and how we know there is an afterlife. It's another big book, another 4.5-pound book, 700 pages, 1,000 references, lots and lots of data. But really, I think the bottom line is it shows that the soul is real, that higher planes of consciousness are real. All 3 books can be bought on Amazon, but it's less expensive if you go to my website or just email me directly at claudeswanson@gmail.com. I can sell them to you directly, and it's a little bit cheaper. Happy to do it. And if you need an autograph, let me know. My website, synchronizeduniverse.com, has some of the information if you need to be reminded. And my email is right there, claudeswanson@gmail. The big questions that we start to ask when we get to this forefront of physics, of consciousness and the afterlife. And I mentioned in my talk in Boulder that was raised for me when I was a little kid. My mother would kneel beside my bed at night, and we would pray before going to sleep. And this question that if I died, what would happen to my soul? And there are prayers about that, but I never thought about it before. When you're a little kid, you don't ask those questions. But suddenly the issue of death and what happens after death came up for me. And it was kind of scary to think about at that point. But since then, I've done a lot of research about it and have learned a lot, which is in these books. We learned that angels and the help of guides and spirits can be very real, and a lot of phenomena like that, that if when you start digging into it, it's amazing how much evidence you can find. What I learned is that there are various levels in the afterlife, and they have to do with the development of our soul, how we have worked through various emotional issues and other psychological issues we have, how we treat others, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a learning process involved with the evolution of the soul. So as I mentioned in Boulder, part of my learning about the afterlife came from books, I guess, as we all kind of, we grow up with whatever religion our parents teach us, but then when we get a little older, we start to think for ourselves. And when I became 12 or 13, I was interested in science, and suddenly I realized that the religion I'd been taught as a child, I didn't have to believe anymore. There was no scientific proof to my standards for it. And so I began asking questions and looking further afield at what the truth was about religion and about the afterlife. It wasn't enough just to be told something from a book. I wanted to do the real research and find out the evidence. So I think one of the problems that we have growing up in our society is that our point of view is materialistic. Our science is really based on materialism. If you learn physics in college, everything starts with particles, electrons, protons, matter. They have mass, they have energy, they have motion, they have charge, and you learn about the rules and the laws that tell you how they behave. But there are no rules about what happens when you die. Like when you die, the matter is all gone. The body's gone, it's buried, it's been cremated. So what's left? How can there be any afterlife in a materialistic view of the universe? And that was a big puzzle for a long time. But in the 1980s, I began realizing there are other aspects of human beings that go beyond the matter. There is an energy that's connected to the soul and connected to consciousness. And as I described recently, that's this torsion energy that actually makes up the soul and that we have around our bodies all the time. It's what makes up what the Chinese call qi. It makes up the energy of the aura. It has lots of very real and measurable effects, even though it's not matter. And the energy of our personality gets preserved and saved in this energy of torsion. So that's one of the things that I learned in doing this research. So at one time, I was a scientific atheist because I couldn't see how there could be an afterlife. In fact, I couldn't really understand at an early time how consciousness could have any effect. I kind of believed what I'd been taught, which is that we live in kind of a deterministic universe where there are certain laws and a cause and effect, and they dictate how things unfold over time. As I've gotten older and done a lot of research, I've realized that consciousness and what we think actually has an enormous power over the universe, that consciousness actually controls this torsion field, which actually changes the nature of space-time around it and can change events. So we can shape the future, and we can change future events, and we can manifest things that we want or that we dream of by focusing on them and using our consciousness in a very concentrated way. In the first chapter of my book, I talk about some of the great inspirational thinkers of the 20th and 19th centuries who showed. Andrew Carnegie was one of the leaders, and Napoleon Hill was a writer who codified his teachings, and he taught that his fortune was really based on using the power of the mind. So this whole power of consciousness is one of the new frontiers in science, and it's one of the aspects I'm trying to emphasize in these books. So I discovered that this force of consciousness has never really been included in physics before, but it certainly is time now for it to finally be included. And I talked about the use of consciousness in Chinese medicine, and how the Russians have, since the 1950s, developed a science that's based on this energy. And this has led to a whole new physics that includes the energy of consciousness, the paranormal, ESP, the out-of-body experiences, and higher planes of consciousness. We actually now are beginning to have a way of understanding these things from a scientific perspective. That's really my goal, is to help with that process. But one conclusion that you're led to is that there are many planes of existence, not just this physical world that we see. There are actually other possible simultaneous realities that we could also experience, other physical realities where the rules are very similar to this one, but there are also higher planes where consciousness interacts with these planes and enables us to exist in these levels. And the afterlife really is consisting of those planes. So in my new book, The Science of the Soul, I've really tried to pull together the data from many different sources to find out what these levels are like and what the truth is. One of the great pioneers, George Meek, says in the last 25 years, mankind has learned more about what happens when we die than was learned in all earlier periods of recorded history. And one reason for that is that science itself has made enormous advances. So we have different ways of studying what life after death is like. And here are a few of the types of states and phenomena and the kinds of data that go into our understanding today of what life after death is like. We have near-death experiences. We have now thousands and thousands of people who have been clinically dead, some for as long as several days, and then they are revived in various ways, and they talk about what they experienced, what they saw, what they can bring back about what the afterlife was like. We have out-of-body experiences where there are millions of people who have learned how to go out of body and to leave their physical body lying on the bed or the sofa, and this little ball of energy can go floating around, can go thousands of miles away, fly up into the sky, see different things. And so we've learned that there's an energy form that does not require the body. And that's a big step toward understanding the afterlife. There are other ways of communicating with the afterlife, electronic voice communications. There are various instruments that have been able to record the spirits of people who have passed away, and communication two-way has gone on in those cases. Thomas Edison was one of the first who was trying to do this, but since the 1960s, we have thousands of recorded interactions now, and we understand a lot more about how that type of communication works. Mediumship is one of the oldest and most respected ways of communication with spirits. There are many people who are clairvoyant or telepathic who are able to hear the voices of spirits and relay them to us, But there's always an issue there, since it's a person. How can we trust that person? Are they making it up? Are they imagining it? Are they cheating us? So there's always an issue of verifiability. Today we have many organizations that put them through tests to prevent any kind of fakery and ensure that they're doing an honest job of communicating. In addition, we have past life regressions, which are hypnotic. We have direct voice, one of the most powerful forms of communication, where some mediums manifest a special energy that enable the spirit in the afterlife to create a voice, a sound, which tape recorders can record, anybody can hear, and that enables loved ones to communicate directly with that spirit. We've had remarkable evidence from that. In my book, I've got many, many examples of communications of this type, because one of the great mediums of this type, called Leslie Flint, was very adept at being able to make this communication possible, and they gave me permission to use a lot of his transcripts from recordings of those interactions. So there are many, many different types of examples of communication with the afterlife, not to mention ghosts, haunted houses, poltergeists, and other more familiar things. We have lots of knowledge of the afterlife from sacred texts written by the great masters down through the years, and the yogis and other people able to go into the afterlife directly and communicate as well. So the bottom line from all this evidence is, what does it lead to? What's our picture of heaven? What is the afterlife? Is there a consistent picture? Is it just a hodgepodge of different conflicting stories? Does it look like somebody's just making up something? Or is there a consistent picture that emerges from many different points of view? And that's really what my book has been trying to do, from about 12 or 14 different sources, different types of information, try to pull together all these different descriptions and seeing if they all merge together, if they seem to be describing the same place, the same state. And how does it work? What do we do when we're there? That's a big question. The short answer is we're learning. This is part of an educational process. The afterlife is really a school. In fact, even here on Earth is a school. We're here to learn, here to have experiences, here to interact with other people who are connected with us in some way or other. And that's really why we meet in this lifetime. This is just sort of a play that we're in to work out some of the issues. The real life for everyone is in what we call the afterlife. That's where the soul lasts forever. That's where the information is retained. The lessons from lifetime after lifetime are retained. So we learn something, it gets used by us, so we're wiser next time. In addition, I've tried to put a little science into these books. I talk about Einstein and the idea of thought experiments, which is what he was a great believer in. The idea of the Gedanken experiment, or the thought experiment, where you imagine a situation and try to figure out what's going to happen from it. This picture illustrates him riding a light beam. That's how he thought of a special relativity. That was his thought experiment that he used that led him to his first relativity theory. In my little model of the paranormal and the afterlife, as I described in my first book, if you think about each little particle, like an electron, for example, moving around in space, it's not just moving by itself. There's lots of energy in space. You can think of them as little particles of light, particles of energy, flying around very rapidly in all directions. Lots of energy in there. That's the vacuum of space, the 0 point energy. A little electron will be bombarded by these particles of energy, by these photons. It'll get knocked around. Each time it gets knocked around, it'll emit another photon in some other direction, and it'll get hit by something else from another side. So it's moving around in a little random walk, very, very fast over a very small scale, and interacting with all the other particles in the universe. So this is sort of an intuitive picture of the quantum domain. This is what particles see. If you take a picture like this, and then you remember that energy gets emitted in a straight line in the direction of travel of the particle when it's hit, then that means that the particle of energy will go off in very narrow focused beams, little cones of energy as shown in the picture here. And that'll mean that it will not interact just with any other random particle anywhere in the universe. It'll tend to only interact with something that's in a straight line with where it happens to be hitting at the moment that it turns. And that means that particles interact only with certain other particles that may be very far away, but happen to be in just the right direction, so they line up with each other. And that led to the synchronized universe idea, which is that particles that we think of as in our universe have to be moving in synchronization with each other. They have to be going through little dances where they're all swirling at the same time, at the same rate, and in phase with each other. So each one sees the other at just the right moment, so they interact. And what that takes you to then is the synchronized universe idea, that all these particles will be oscillating together in phase, like a little coordinated dance, a synchronized dance. And if you look at other particles that are far away in the universe, their motions have to match up with the particles that are nearby. And that may seem like something esoteric that you don't need to know or don't care about, but what it leads you to is the conclusion that there are many possible universes. There are many possible parallel systems, because if you're in a system where your particles are synchronized, they will see each other. You'll see the other particles that are synchronized with yours. And that'll be a certain subset of all the particles. There can be other universes, other sets of particles that are moving in a different frequency or a different phase. They'll all see each other themselves, but not our universe. So you have many universes all at the same time, and we'll only see the one we're synchronized with. And the whole idea is kind of like an electric fan with a little strobe light that's flashing. And if that flash is synchronized with the turning of the blades of the fan, just the right speed, then the blades will appear solid. They'll appear stationary. And because each time the next fan blade moves into position, it flashes again, and it looks like it's the same blade just sitting still. But if you change this frequency or change the phase, then that fan blade disappears. It's not there. It doesn't look there anymore. And so that's the synchronized universe idea. So you can have different universes of very different things going on, and they're all in the same space, but they don't see each other. And that applies to physical matter. And now we're learning more and more that this idea of parallel universes and of multiverses it's a viable scientific idea. Many scientists now are beginning to believe this is really the way things are. If you want to explain something like the way a healer can pass his hand into a physical object, such as some of the great healers of South America or the Philippines do it, you can now understand how it's possible. There are lots of examples where this ability to make matter transparent or to be able to pass through solid matter without damaging the object, how it's possible because of a model like this. With the same picture, you can see how a higher dimensional being can exist. A higher dimensional being would exist in many of these synchronized planes at the same time, like this little green oval in this picture. It's really present across many planes. It's a higher dimensional being. It might be a spirit, for example. It might be some ET that operates in a higher dimension. If we are living in our normal 3D world, we only may see fragments of it, pieces of it, in our perspective. But from a higher perspective, we'd be able to see what its true nature was. Another piece of this scientific understanding of these higher dimensions is from torsion. Torsion is this energy I mentioned before that the Russians discovered in the 1950s. It is an energy of the twisting of space-time, that Einstein thought of space as being able to curve, and then that was what gravity was based on. But the Russians discovered that it can also twist. And this twisting is what consciousness is really based on. It's how we communicate our thoughts to other people. It's how we can reach out our mind to distant places and receive information. It's how we can send healing. It's a special energy that involves the twisting of space-time. So we'll have more to say about that in later chapters, but it's an important component. One of the key aspects of torsion is that it has parts that travel backwards in time. So it has a part that travels forward in time like a light beam, but a part that travels backwards in time, like something that was sent from the future into the past. And we know that there are experiments involving, say, remote healing. Dean Radin has done experiments with healers in South America, sending energy to patients in America, and they send the energy a week or two before or a week or two after the event, and they can still, by their mind, by their consciousness, they can make it last, they can make it arrive at the point they want it to, so they can send information forwards and backwards in time. In the same way, PK, or psychokinesis, the ability to affect a random event generator, such as the Princeton Paralab did millions of experiments with those devices. They could also control the time at which they affected the device. They could affect it in the future or in the past. So this is one more demonstration that torsion must be really an important part of consciousness, because it describes this ability to send things forward and backward in time. Because it can go forward and backward in time, that means that when a little particle, like the one I showed earlier, is moving around in space, is being bombarded with energy, then some of this energy can be torsion energy that can knock the particle back in time. So the particle doesn't just go one direction in time. It doesn't just zigzag, random walk forward in time. It can also zigzag backward in time. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, discovered back in the 1940s that this was a key particle, a key aspect of particle physics. One night when he was still a grad student, I guess, he was at the Manhattan Project, and he was close to getting his PhD, and he was doing some work out there on the bomb project. His advisor, John Wheeler, called him up from Princeton, 3-hour time difference, and wakes him up in the middle of the night and says, "Richard, I got a great idea. I know why all electrons have the same charge." And Richard said, well, why? Because they're all the same electron. And it's not what you want to hear it for in the morning, but the idea is that Wheeler was proposing is that electrons can go forward in time, and then backward in time, and then forward in time again. So they keep passing through the present time over and over again, and they look like different particles, but they always have the same charge because it's really the same particle. So that kind of led to Feynman's idea called space-time physics, where particles can travel backward and forward in time, and it explains a lot that has become the basis for modern Western physics. But torsion, when it's present, like in this picture here, it will change how much of the time the particle goes backwards and how much of the time it goes forward. You can actually slow down its progress in time, or speed it up. So you can change the rate of time with torsion energy. And a Russian scientist named Chernobrov has done experiments building a little chamber with torsion generators around the outside of it and sending in this torsion energy into the chamber. And he can make the time in the chamber pass more slowly or more quickly than time passes outside the chamber. So it's just one more aspect of the application of torsion energy. Another thing that this torsion energy does is that these little orbits that I described earlier that a particle will be doing in its synchronized universe, it's a little orbiting motion, that when torsion is present, it'll make that little orbit more complicated. Instead of being a nice little circle or an ellipse like on the left-hand picture, it'll make it get knocked backwards in time more often. So it'll have more loops to it, like in the middle picture. It'll have more little curlicues, little whirls. Or if it's a lot of extra left-handed torsion, it could look like the one on the right, with a whole lot of extra little curlicues. What this will do is that it means that that little orbit, instead of having one frequency, like it had in the left-hand picture, now it has many frequencies, and the new frequencies are higher. They're higher frequency, which means it'll synchronize with higher planes of consciousness. So that as you change the path of motion of the particle, you're able to synchronize with higher planes of consciousness. So that our normal physical world that we're synchronized with normally to get us to drive to work and to walk across the street and things like that, that's the left-hand picture. But if you really want to talk to God, you're better off going to one of the higher planes of consciousness, like one of the right-hand pictures. And that involves more left-handed torsion. You can bring that in through meditation and special breathing exercises. I'll give you an example. These are just saying again what I just said written down here. So meditation can be used to assist in this process because you're kind of giving your body more of the higher energy vibrations when the torsion builds up, but then it's still really good to maintain your conscious control so that these frequencies stay synchronized, and they enable you to stay connected to the higher planes. Here's an example of a man who was a master at it, the 16th Karmapa, Buddhist saint in Tibet. When he meditated, he was able to do a special meditation which raised his frequency to the extent that he became invisible. And there were people around him, including the photographer and other people as well. This man is sitting in the middle of this picture. He's sitting on a throne in the middle of this picture. And you can see remnants in the picture of his body there, but he is mostly invisible because the frequencies, he's shifted to the frequencies of these self-orbits, so he's no longer primarily in the physical plane. And I guess the other big question that has come up for people is, well, where is heaven? Where are the afterlife planes and all these glorious cities and other wonderful things people talk about in meditation and the afterlife? And the answer appears to be that they occur because of the synchronized universe that connects us to these high frequencies, and they correspond to very small scales of vibration. And so if you want to draw a picture here of the frequencies of the universe, things that we know about, on the left-hand side are the very long wavelengths. On the left-hand side, the biggest wavelengths would be the entire universe itself, 10 to the 26 meters, a gigantic, hundreds and billions of light years across. That's the longest wavelength that we can imagine. As you start making shorter and shorter and shorter, you get down in the middle toward things that are more human scale, atoms, molecules, etc. And then to the right-hand side, you get to even shorter scales of vibration, very, very rapid vibrations that correspond to the subtle energies and the energies of consciousness where the afterlife planes, we believe, exist. The astral dimension, the mental, the causal, the Buddhic, all these higher planes that are talked about in Eastern mysticism probably exist in these very high frequencies in very short wavelengths. And people who study this whole situation of what the afterlife is like draw a picture, kind of like a cartoon, to illustrate the basic arrangement. George Meek, one of the great researchers of the afterlife, draws this picture. Here's like a hotel. It's like a hotel or a department store. You come in on the outside when you die, and you enter the ground floor. And there are elevators that go up and elevators that go down. And based on how you've lived your life, your level of evolution, you may go up to one of the lower planes, like the lower astral plane. You've done a lot of bad things in your life, been a very violent person. You may be on the bottom of those planes and have to suffer some, and you'll probably be with people who are kind of like you, and that's really your punishment. Is that you're like with people who are like you, okay? And it's because like vibrations tend to attract like vibrations. The higher vibration people will go to the middle astral plane or even the higher astral planes, and they'll find themselves in very beautiful, restful, bucolic environments where things are very pleasant. And as we work out our issues, work out our anger issues, or other issues that we may have psychologically through many incarnations, we then are able to go higher and find ourselves in the upper planes, the causal, the mental planes, or the celestial planes closer to God. And they're more and more blissful the higher you go. So in a real quick nutshell, that's sort of a picture that students of this whole subject arrive at. And these different floors also correspond to levels of consciousness, and they also correspond to frequencies because each one of them is really a synchronized plane. So the same principle of a synchronized universe, I think, applies to all of these planes. You're synchronizing with the level that you belong on. So that was kind of the basis, the center of my research in this book. And I wasn't really aware beyond that until a couple of years ago that something else needed to be part of it. And that is that there's something happening on our planet right now, that things are speeding up, that we are becoming more and more in contact with the higher planes. Our ability to make contact has been rising. And in fact, there are also advanced beings of various types that are trying to interact with us and help us as we go through some of this evolution. And that's called the shift. It's a rapid speed up as we jump some of these levels and as we advance in the levels of consciousness that we have. This for me started in the 1990s when I began exploring some of this stuff. I was in Virginia and I went down to the ARE library, Virginia Beach. That was where Edgar Cayce's foundation was. He had a huge library, wonderful books that I couldn't get anywhere else. And I spent a lot of time down there. And of course, Cayce was famous for his thousands and thousands of readings he did of other people's past lives. And he played a big role in introducing us to the idea of reincarnation. But one of the other things he did was he talked about something called a pole shift, a shift in conditions on the earth that he said would happen around the year 2000. And that's a little scary for a person who is studying this stuff and finds all this solid evidence that he's accurate in many of his health readings, but he's telling us about some big changes that are in the offing. Here's one of his readings. He spoke about a testing period that would end with the shifting of the Earth's poles. He said it begins in 1958 and ends with the changing wrought by the upheavals and shifting of the poles, as begins with the rain in 98 as time is counted in the present. When he was asked about this, he said it was to take place in about the year 2000 or 2001, when there is a shifting of the poles or a new cycle begins. In other readings, he reinforced this idea. he said that the frigid or semi-tropical will become more tropical, and moss and fern will grow, and these will begin in the periods of 58 to 98. That's pretty dramatic. And he also talked about spiritual effects that would occur on the earth when his light will be seen again in the clouds. As to times, as to seasons, as to places alone, it is given to those who have named the name and who bear the mark of his calling and his election in their bodies. So these remarks like this, of which there were quite a few, sort of alerted me to this idea of maybe a pole shift. But a lot of us looked for something happening in the year 2000 because that's what he had originally said. But of course, it didn't happen then. But some things did happen then, and looking back, we can see there's a connection. I also found other psychics in the same time period predicting something very similar. Mary Summerrain, in about 1982, had written a series of books predicting similar effects. And they also talked about emotional illnesses, psychological effects, and other phenomena that would come along with it. So all of these were sort of precursors, I guess, to what came next for me. Casey talked about the birth of a higher civilization and an incoming root race, which would be an upgrading of the level of consciousness, an upgrading of humanity that would be associated with this change. I couldn't really understand how such a pole shift could occur. It wasn't obvious to me for a long time. But then, as I read more, I came across a theory of Charles Hapgood, who explained a way to have a pole shift of the type that Casey had described. In the book called The Path of the Pole, he said polar wandering is based on the idea that the outer shell of the Earth shifts about from time to time, moving from some continents toward and others away from the poles, changing their climates. It's almost as though the crust of the Earth is like the skin of an orange, and the inner part of the Earth is like is molten, and therefore the skin can shift on the inner core without the core having to shift itself. So that requires much less mass has to move for a pole shift to occur. From Hapgood, he found out that the most recent North Pole is Hudson Bay. That was the epicenter of the North American ice sheet until the last ice age. So we found evidence in various places for pole shifts that have happened within historical time. Here are some of the previous locations of the pole according to Hapgood's work. You can see the map here showing Yukon, Greenland Sea, Hudson Bay, and the present pole. So the North Pole has moved, according to this data, on the surface of the Earth. Or another way of thinking about it is that the surface of the Earth, the crust of the Earth, has shifted. So those parts are moved to occupy the northern pole of spinning of the Earth. So you can picture it sort of like this, that the crust on the outside is solid, but the mantle and inner core are liquid or semi-molten and can allow that kind of motion. So that could explain this kind of phenomenon. Even Einstein became captivated by Hapgood's idea. And just prior to his death, he wrote a foreword to a book on pole shifts saying, "I frequently receive communications from people who wish to consult me concerning their unpublished ideas. It goes without saying that these ideas are very seldom possessed of scientific validity. The very first communication, however, that I received from Mr. Hapgood electrified me. His idea is original, of great simplicity, and if it continues to prove itself, of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth. So this stuff, might be true. It might be the real correct explanation for what is going on. We have other little snippets of evidence, but from other people that are supportive of this. There are ancient maps, like the Piri-Reis map, in which Antarctica is depicted with this accurate outline of its continental, hard, rocky substrate with no ice on the outside. So it was clearly made in a time period when there was no ice. And that must have been a long time ago, because it's been covered with ice for many thousands of years. So again, this is suggestive to the idea that that these shifts can happen. One way it could happen is a coronal mass ejection. The sun spits out a plasma, a flare from the sun that can be very strong. It's a charged gas made of protons. We have these all the time occurring, especially at the solar maxes. We get coronas and things like that impinge our Earth from these charged gases from the sun, these solar flares. But I calculated during that time period how strong a solar flare it would take to cause a pole shift based on Hapgood's idea. And it was about 100 times more powerful than anything that we'd seen in recent decades. But still, that's not beyond imagination. So I realized, hey, maybe this is not such a crazy idea. And so when the year 2000 rolled around, and Casey had predicted that the shift was going to occur, and I had now calculations that told me, hey, this could happen, and I could see how it was possible, I was concerned. And I kept a close watch on what was happening on the sun. It so happens that the SOHO satellite had been invented by NASA a few years earlier and launched. It's a satellite that watches the sun in many different frequency bands. It takes very accurate pictures of the surface of the sun. So it can watch for solar flares, watch for sunspots, and it would know if we were going to be hit by a powerful solar flare. You get some advance notice, maybe a day or two advance notice. So I watched it like a hawk every day. So here's an ad from that satellite with the promotional piece of literature. So it was a very intense solar max. It turned out there were lots and lots of sunspots, and it was very concerning. One day I was at a rally down on the mall in Washington, D.C., and a spiritual leader named Drunvalo Melchizedek was there, and we were both very aware of how active the sun was. This was 1999, and he commented he believed it was going to spew out that flare and cause a pole shift in the next 6 months or so. It didn't happen, but other things that were very strange did happen in that time period. Here's an example of an image from SOHO. The sun is covered up on the middle of the image by a round disc to block out the most intense light so the camera won't be saturated, and it can photograph the flares, the coronas outside that. But notice there's some little object on the left-hand side that has a bright spot and a tail to it, and it does not belong there. The way the camera is set up, it has to be a huge object. It has to be on the size of a planet because it's very far away, and yet it's showing up big. It was a moving object that was photographed near the sun during this time period. It was not the only one. There were a couple dozen. Here's a close-up of another object, and you can see how interesting it looks. It's not something familiar or man-made. Here's another one. And there were beams occasionally and other strange energy formations that did not look natural that were photographed around these objects. Here's another one. Mars is seen in the upper picture there as a blob, but the lower picture is some unknown object that's also huge, on the order of the size of a planet, near the sun, right at the solar max. These became known as sun cruisers. They were watched by the people who watched SOHO. They noticed these things, but no one could explain them. The object, 6 hours later, has moved and shows some other strange phenomena. Another object near the limb of the sun is seen here emitting a ray or a beam or something strange. It looks very peculiar. There's a close-up of it. Another photograph of the sun, and this is from the LASCO telescope from the SOHO. The sun is in the middle. That large blue disk is the blanking disk that's put in front of the sun to keep the camera from saturating. But there are two black spheres on either side, left and right, from the sun that are both gigantic. I mean, they're as big as the gas giants, as big as Jupiter. They're huge, and they happen to be there. Why? What are they doing? What's this all about? This is very peculiar. Another object is moving across the scene in the year 2000. And so what happened was that there was not much discussion online about these strange objects during the year 2000. But as a result, the great coronal mass ejection that was predicted and expected didn't happen. And at the time, I kind of wondered if maybe somebody was helping us. Was it possible there was some higher intelligence or high civilization that was coming in and messing with the sun, calming it down, avoiding some of these destructive coronal mass ejections? It seemed like a fantasy at the time. I could not imagine it could be possibly true, but it was coincidental otherwise. And it turns out that since then, we've seen other examples of images like this. Here's another one, another object that shows up. And typically these only appear for a day or even a few hours, not much longer, so they don't move at all like planets. So I kind of tried to understand what could they be, what's going on here. And at the same time, I became aware that there was lots of other intuitive guidance. We've got intuitive information that some higher dimensional phenomena were going on in our solar system. Dolores Cannon hypnotically regressed thousands of people into past lives, and many of them talked about the shift that was we were in the middle of, and talked about us shifting into the fourth density and eventually becoming a fifth density planet, a higher dimensional life form than we are right now. So this was one of the currents of thought that was present at the time of all these events. Recently, whistleblowers like Corey Good have come forward to tell us that at the time that these strange objects were showing up around the sun, that there was a secret program, a secret space program run by the U.S. Navy that was operating out in space in this region. And they were very much aware of these objects. And they had tried to communicate with them. And it appeared that they were involved with somehow stabilizing our sun, but they would not explain to our Navy what they were here for. It was clearly a very advanced civilization operating craft that were thousands and thousands of miles across. At the same time, what we've learned is that other changes are occurring in our solar system, not just in the sun, but all of the planets of our solar system are seeing changes in the magnetic field, in their temperature, in cloud formations, in volcanism. A scientist named Dmitriev has been one of the leaders in describing and keeping track of these changes. David Wilcock in the US has also given lectures about these changes. What they conclude is that whatever's happening is affecting all of the planets in our solar system. It's not just the Earth. So it's not global warming. It's not some commonplace idea from too much carbon dioxide, because every planet in the solar system is showing the same effects. So there's something else that's going on that's across the board and that needs to be taken into account. It appears to be related to this shift in the sun. So according to Corey Good, they knew that these huge craft were guided intelligently, but they were by some very advanced race that seemed to be kind of above the normal politics of our solar system. They were not interested in communicating very much with us, but they seemed to have a higher purpose of some sort. So the big question is how these changes are going to affect consciousness on the Earth. What do they imply for what we're going through, what our future is, and what is the evidence that these things are real? One of the most intriguing messages that we've encountered from studying these phenomena is the message that the Earth is in the process of shifting upward into the fourth density. Right now we are third density beings. And in my first chapter of my book, I explain what I believe density means. You can think of it kind of like dimension, but it has a little bit different connotation. But it certainly also relates to what planes of consciousness you're resonating with or synchronized with. And as we shift up into these higher planes, we will become more psychic, become more empathic, and develop a lot of very advanced and desirable qualities that are needed to interact with the ETs that are starting to make their appearance in our solar system. Of course, we've been seeing and hearing reports of ETs for 50 years or so, ever since Roswell. But what we're finding now is that there's a lot of interaction. These stories that seem like they're about very different subjects, like the afterlife and like extraterrestrials, flying saucers. They seem so different from each other, and yet we find that they're not so different. There's a connection between them. For one thing, when people go have an abduction experience, when they encounter an extraterrestrial, they often do it in the out-of-body state. They're often taken out of body and they interact with the ET in the OBE state. There's a lot of other reasons why we think that the ETs are becoming more able to interact with us today, and why, as we increase our density and our vibrational level, these states will become more familiar to us. From one of the contactees who has had these experiences and talked about them, says the Earth will be able to join the Federation. In other words, the Federation you hear about in Star Trek is not just imaginary. It's actually something real, according to many of these witnesses. There is an organization of many of these visitors in which they communicate with each other, and they actually work for a higher purpose to help us evolve. And that's one of the remarkable things that I've learned from the afterlife studies, is that so much of reincarnation, so much of afterlife experiences is to help us to raise our vibrational level, raise our consciousness, raise our ability to love one another, to take care of one another, to be of service to other people. And as we do, we can access the higher levels of consciousness. So next time we find ourselves there, we'll be at a higher plane. We'll be at a higher level in that hotel or that department store in the sky. And those are all more pleasant. So this is kind of part of the path of the soul that we're all taking together. Here are some witnesses who have studied the subject from different perspectives. Here's one, Michael Glickman, who's a crop circle expert and also a clairvoyant. He says, we're talking about a staggering moment in human history. There's no doubt that in the next 10 years, we're going to have direct communication with our cousins. We're not going to be prepared for this cataclysm until a critical mass of humanity has moved comfortably into the fifth dimension. Another one, Sherry Wild, who's a UFO contactee, says it's an absolute truth that the Earth will be moving into the higher vibration, and those unable to survive that shift because of their lower frequency will be taken to a new place to continue their growth at their own pace without interfering with the Earth's evolution or their fellow human beings' right to live in peace. I think one of the great messages that comes through from studying these subjects is that all of us are loved. We are all immortal souls. There's a supreme being. You can think of it as the universe, as universal consciousness, however you want to think about it. But there's a connectedness of all life in the universe, and it works to help each of us to evolve and become wiser and more advanced as we grow. And that energy wants to take care of each of us, so that it may sound scary at first blush to talk about a pole shift or some dramatic earth change. But as you look into it more deeply, you find that there are many other beings who are involved with us, overseeing us, watching us. And what they say is that they've been here for hundreds or thousands of years. And one of the main reasons they are here is to help us get through this time. And that's the remarkable message. Here is another clairvoyant, Sal Rochelle, who says Earth is becoming a fourth density planet. This implies that only those souls vibrating at fourth density and above will be allowed to incarnate on the Earth from this point forward. Those souls who decide to remain with the Earth are going through a spiritual awakening. Those souls who desire to live in true peace and prosperity will remain with the Earth, or in some cases ascend and go to other planets that accommodate peace and prosperity. Another remarkable encounter was described by Bruce Moen, who learned to go out of body at the Monroe Institute and would frequently have out-of-body adventures where he would find himself traveling through space, exploring different dimensions. He investigated various planes in the afterlife. In one case, he encountered a group of extraterrestrials and sensed a massive craft. They told him, "We've come to this region to witness events taking place on the Earth, specifically the great event that is happening here to the Earth School. It is our understanding that one of the potential results of the Earth changes, as you call them, is that the Earth will be joining our Federation." So this is one more ET contact that brings up this idea that this federation of planets, which you may have thought of as just being imaginary, but those who study this deeply, those in the secret space program and other researchers, find that this is actually a real thing. And that as we arise to the level of consciousness where we can handle interacting at those levels, we can be invited to take part in those interactions. And what it will bring to the Earth is new technology and new knowledge that will enable us to live much better lives much cleaner lives, technology that will not involve oil, will have propulsion that'll be cheap and quick and will enable us to change our lives radically. So it's a whole new opportunity, a whole new world that's opening up as part of these changes that are underway. One researcher of Bob Monroe said the next 100 years from about 1970 is an intense energy period in the growth of the planet. The highest and lowest vibratory souls will be back on the earth at the same time. And if you think about it, you probably know some of both types. There will be changes in the physical earth structure that will represent shifts in the consciousness of the earth level. The earth is moving into a higher level from more gross energies. And the other part of this, which echoes what Edgar Casey predicted, that new, more advanced beings will start to incarnate. Humans, just like us, but often having done more of their homework, more advancement, more intelligent, more psychic, will be able to come down here and incarnate and show up here, and they become the new root race, so an upgrade in the level of our world, and is part of this whole process. And one of them says, I'm especially mindful of what the theosophical rendering pointed out for the fifth root race. That's what's coming in. Consciousness separated into two hemispheres, east and west, now fusing back together, a global leap in species refinement. This is exactly what I've discovered in my research. The fifth root race is not just another step up some kind of cosmic ladder. It's a pivotal shift in who and what we are as human beings. The success or failure of human ensoulment is said to occur at this level of evolutionary growth. So it's an exciting time, dramatic changes. It won't happen in 1 year or 1 month. It'll evolve over time. But we're right now at the most exciting time. We're at the threshold of the new events that are happening. And PMH Atwater has studied some of the kids that are being born now and coming in. And some of them have abilities that are far beyond what we're used to or what kids used to have. He said, these kids acted as if they have never been on this or any other planet before, and frankly considered the human body, any body, a useless, clumsy appendage. They appeared utterly unconcerned with family issues or personal relationships. Creation to them was alive and conscious, the very gases we breathe, living intelligences. Often they refer to themselves as stewards, guardians, or keepers of that which enables cells and molecules to exist, rather than as evolving souls. So all of this is going on. These are powerful changes. They're occurring not just on the Earth, but in other planets in our solar system as well. And just to wrap up here, what is some of the evidence that we see, or some of the physical evidence we can put our hands on and measure that these changes are happening, not just our imagination. Here is the Earth's magnetic field. It's been weakening steadily over the past several hundred years, and in the last few decades, it's been speeding up its change. At the same time, global volcanism, the number of volcanoes on the planet, have also been steadily rising, as you can see from this curve, from very dramatic changes. If you watch the motion of the pole, the North Pole, you probably have all heard how it's been speeding up in its motion. This chart shows the position of the North Pole as seen from the top of the Earth. And you can see in the last couple of decades how it's been going faster and faster and even shifting in direction. And this last part, the last 5 or 10 years, while pretty dramatic on here, I'm not as sure about, because the data is not readily available. The governments are saying, yes, it's speeding up. So far, they've been depicting it as going in a straight line, but there's some ship data at sea by icebreakers in the North region that indicate maybe it's going to the right some and hooking around. Either case, it's certainly speeding up and acting like it's getting ready to do some kind of a shift. Here's a map of how fast it's moving in the past few hundred years. And you can see that from 1600 to 1900, it averaged, less than 10 kilometers per year in motion. But it's greatly accelerated that speed in the last couple of decades. So it's clearly something is happening with the North Pole that is suggesting, again, the Earth may be getting very close to a pole shift. And then if you want to understand the physical phenomenon that could be connected to this, it might be underlying these kinds of changes in the Earth. I have a little model that I've developed that might explain what we're seeing, because it's not just the physical changes on the Earth, the magnetic poles, etc., but there's also this prediction from many people, including what you're seeing with the new kids coming in, that intelligence and psychic ability is increasing. So how can you explain those things? And what I introduce here to try to connect those ideas is that left-handed torsion has been found by the Russians to be related to psychic ability. It enables people to have more ESP. And we have several data points that indicate that or support that. One is that there's an area in the sky called the Great Attractor in Virgo. It's an area with a very strong left-handed torsion. Whenever the Earth passes under that region in the sky, ESP is enhanced. And this was discovered by James Spottiswoode when he looked at how ESP is different at different times of day. And he found one 2-hour period when the ESP is several times greater than average. And that is the time when when people on the Earth at that point happen to be under this region of the sky. There have also been measurements made by Davis and Rawls, the magnetic healing researchers, that find that the south pole of a magnet also increases ESP. The Russians did experiments at the North Pole and found again that ESP was stronger there. So left-handed torsion could possibly be connected to this great shift that we're expecting to happen. And the other part of this puzzle is that civilizations have gone through cycles in the past. There have been golden ages in the past and dark ages in the past. We know that at some times in the past, civilizations have been able to build things that we can't explain today. The huge 1,000-ton blocks at Baalbek Temple in Lebanon would be very difficult today for any modern moving equipment to manipulate. The pyramids in Giza, there have been attempts to replicate their construction that have all failed miserably. On a clay tablet in Iraq was found, that had been a library at one time in the past, was found a number that's the largest number anybody's ever found in the ancient world. It's called the Nineveh constant. People didn't know for a long time what it was. Then they figured out that it's the product of the period of all the planets. If you measure how long each planet takes to go around the sun, convert that to seconds, and multiply all those 9 numbers together, you get this number. And it's very accurate. But that's a number that has only in our society, we've been able to reproduce that number in the last couple of decades. So it means that at some time in the past, a very advanced civilization was present that produced that number and recorded it. In India, in the Harappa region, the Harappa culture, there are places that show radioactivity such as would only be found from a nuclear war. There's also regions of green glass, which means that the sand and the soil was fused into a glass, which is known to only occur when a nuclear blast occurs. So it indicates that at some time in the past, India had nuclear weapons. And there are passages in the Mahabharata that describe the destructive power of this great weapon that they had at that time. And the fallout, the physical reaction to people matches exactly what a nuclear weapon would do. So lots of indications that we've had civilizations rising and falling over the years. In the Hindu Vedas, they describe this cycle by what's called the Yuga Cycle, which is a 24,000 year cycle with the dark Kali Yuga at the bottom. That's the Dark Age period. The Spiritual Age, the Satya Yuga at the top. That's the Golden Age. And so civilizations go through this over and over again. And at one time, it appears that the wise civilizations in past times remembered some of those earlier cycles. And it's very likely that the Great Pyramids were built during the declining part of the cycle, the Treta Yuga, when those energies that had created the Golden Age were declining, and they were trying to preserve them. And the pyramid, it turns out, creates left-handed torsion at its base, which may have been their attempt to preserve left-handed torsion for the priesthood class in Giza. But here's a possible model that fits together all these little pieces of the puzzle together. If you imagine our solar system as a little orange dot on the left-hand side at the upper side here, with the planets as rings going around the sun, and it's moving through space. And of course, as it does, the motion of the galaxy rotates, and so the sun will be carried along with that. Some people have proposed there's also a dark star, perhaps a large planet or a black hole that the sun is orbiting around in a very long cycle. It's been called Planet 9 by some people. And that could account for this 24,000 years when things tend to repeat. If there is a region in space with enhanced left-handed torsion, a cloud of left-handed torsion that we pass through every cycle, then that could cause something like the cycle of the yugas that I just showed you. When we go through the cloud, we will go through this golden age, this enhancement of left-handed torsion, enhancement of ESP that will account for the changes that we saw there. Corey Goode from the Secret Space Program claims that people from that program have gone out into space and have actually gone ahead of where the sun is moving and looked at what's out there and have encountered a cloud of some kind, and it has certain emotional and psychological effects that, to my mind, could be examples of left-handed torsion. So this is sort of a picture that we propose that may explain the changes that Dmitriev and Wilcox and others are talking about in our solar system. We know that one of the nearby stars, kind of a sister star to our own, called Proxima Centauri, only 4 light years away, did have a flash last year. It exploded in some huge event last year that could be like the solar flash that's being predicted for our sun, that may be in store in the next few years and will be the crowning marker of this evolution, this shift that we're going through. And this is just an overview of the solar neighborhood that we're in, trying to understand how, as the sun moves through interstellar space, its solar wind pushes the dust and other particles in front of it, but they kind of pile up in a bow wave around it. And the new matter that it encounters, the dark matter from this cloud, will be on the left-hand side as we run into this region. And it just so happens that there was a very recent article in the news talking about a dark matter hurricane that we'll be moving into. And this is a remnant of a small galaxy that had collided with our own Milky Way galaxy a long time ago. So there's various other little circumstantial pieces of evidence here that may support this whole picture. And then here's some recent photographs that I think are really, really intriguing, that kind of back up the idea that we may be getting some higher dimensional help as we approach this time. These are photographs of the limb of the sun. That's the sun, the upper right-hand corner of that image. And what do you see in the middle? There's some spherical object with some tentacle or tornado that is reaching down to the sun's surface. But the size of this sphere, the little sphere, is larger than the Earth, much larger than the Earth. So this is a huge object that is interacting with the sun, doing something to the sun's plasma. A few months ago, there was another strange event that happened. The solar observatory at Sunspot, New Mexico, was shut down for several weeks, and FBI agents arrived suddenly, didn't really explain why they were there, and it's one of the most capable observatories for observing the sun. That same week that they showed up there, a lady in Indiana, Gina Maria Colvin Hill, from her backyard with her little backyard observatory telescope that she had on the back of her camera, took this photograph. The left-hand side is the sun, but then there are objects near the sun, again, that don't belong there. There's some gigantic thing with like a half of a sphere with some steps on it, some smaller vehicles. But these seem like craft of some kind that have all arrived to interact with our sun. So again, this picture seems to be supported that somebody may be helping us. If they're trying to delay the sun's explosion and delay the solar flash and moderate it so that at a level that we can survive it, that we can handle it, then they may be well trying to help us get through this potentially crucial period. So we interpret these images as evidences that a powerful ET presence is in our solar system, and it's working to help us survive the imminent flash. This is consistent with the sphere being alliance that's described by Corey Good and David Wilcox. Some kinds of events that we might expect if we were hit by a strong left-handed torsion wave from a solar flash would be things like this. It could affect volcanoes. It would certainly cause a pole shift. It would cause huge earthquakes, disrupt communication, even materials properties like the yield strength of metals might be affected. So you could expect aircraft failures and other types of phenomena like that. So there's a whole range of destructive consequences that would be possible depending on how it happened and to what strength it had when it happened. As far as the timing goes, the best I can do is the following. This is on the dark line here is a map of the sunspot cycles, the solar max 1990, the solar max in 2000. You can see those as peaks here, but remarkably, they've been kind of getting smaller, and they've also been slowing down in their period, which is kind of unusual. And this might be because of this interference from this craft. Of course, it might just be coincidence. But I reason that if there is a group trying to help us, to protect us, to get through this period, then what they'd want to do is prevent a solar flash from hitting the Earth during one of the solar maxes. They'd want, as we pass through this cloud of dark matter, which will have lumps in it, it'll have some regions that have higher concentrations of left-handed torsion. And what you want to do is make sure that when the sun hits those regions, it's not at the maximum. It's at a minimum or a calmer period when it hits these lumps of strong concentration of left-handed torsion. And my theory is that that may be what they're trying to do. So therefore, I would predict that the solar flash would be most likely to occur in the valley in the solar activity that we'll see over the next 4 or 5 years. And that, or if worst case scenario would be that if we miss that period, then maybe the next time after the next hump, back in 27 or 2028, the next valley would be then, perhaps it would happen then. But the way things have been unfolding, it would not surprise me if it happens relatively soon, in the next 6 years or so. And therefore I'd predict that if I were a betting man, that this would be the most likely time that it could happen. Now, what will happen when it occurs? And one of the biggest effects appears to be that those who are ready can move on to the 4th density, and those will probably be the ones who stay on the Earth, while it appears that those who are not ready, who want to stay 3rd density, who still want to practice things like warfare and fighting, whatever happens to be that they haven't had enough of yet, they haven't developed or worked through that in their own evolution, they may have to go to some other planet to work on those, because the Earth is moving up to a higher density. And this is indicated by a hypnotic regression that Dolores Cannon conducted with one of her clients, John, who said that this is all going to be changing very shortly because the Earth is going to be too highly evolved for these spirits. So we're going to be shipping these souls out. John laughed suddenly. You know, it's like, okay, you had your chance here. Next boat is going to Arcturus, humorously. Yep, you had your chance here. Now we have to ship you out to one of those other planets that are over near Arcturus. Yes, he says, those are still evolving planets. And these higher vibrational spirits won't come back. They won't come back here because this planet Earth is changing. So this is one more indication that the shift may also involve a shifting or splitting of the Earth, or a splitting of the populations of the Earth based on your level of development. However, from everything I've seen, I think it'll all be done in a very gentle and humane way, so that many people may not even know when the shift has occurred. Anyway, so these are just some ideas here, trying to understand what's going on. I love the quote from Albert Einstein: whoever undertakes to set himself up as a judge in the field of truth and knowledge is shipwrecked by the laughter of the gods. So I offer this theory with great humility. And he said, if we knew what we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? And Bob Monroe was right when he said, we're more than our physical bodies. Through prayer, meditation, and visualization, we can create the world we want. And as Victor Hugo said, all of the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So that's the beginning. That's the introduction to my book. You can find out more at my website, synchronizeduniverse.com, or by emailing me to purchase the books at claudeswanson@gmail.com. And now we can see if we have any questions. So thank you very much. Okay, here we go. I think time, we know it is specific to our plane of 3D existence. We know mathematically there are dimensions that are not time dependent, but who knows if that is actually describing a true reality. Followers of Ekankar routinely experience OBE, not sure about time travel. Good questions. You did not just reference dark matter. UG, a gravitational universe. No. 2 different values of gravity, big G and little g. No. LOL. I don't think that was a question. Paul Sperry asked about when one learns to shift their frequencies, as in the metaphor of the strobe light on a fan blade, do they shift to another dimension or to a different time within our third dimension? Have ones found a way to choose their destination and successfully return to the present? I would say my understanding of that is that if we shift our frequency, we're shifting to a different parallel reality. And we may not really experience it as being different, but we may notice small, subtle changes. I know that people who study matrix energetics, that's one, or shamanism, those are areas where people sometimes shift to parallel realities. And oftentimes, I mean, since you're only in one reality at the time, you don't necessarily notice a difference. But I talked to one lady one time who used to go jogging in La Jolla, and one day she noticed that there were a couple of trees that were missing. The number of trees had changed along the path that she jogged. There are various reports that suggest that in time travel, when we time travel to some place and then come back, we may come back to a different reality than we were in before. It may be very, very similar, but there may be subtle changes. And that this idea of multiple realities can resolve the contradictions built into time travel. So that's how I think about it, that oftentimes it's very small changes. Like in matrix energetics, for example, if you break a leg in this reality, one of the ways they can cure it is by shifting to a parallel reality where you didn't break your leg, and you get instant cures in that way. Some Qigong masters appear to do this as well, and in some shamanic traditions, that type of thing also seems to happen. So it might be that there are people like this who can shift realities quite frequently. It's just not part of our normal physics, but it may be a part of our experience. So that's my best answer, I guess. Are you familiar with Hannes Alfvén's magnetohydrodynamics? Yes, I am. But I haven't seen a good description. I mean, I've heard Corey Good and others say that in the secret space program or some other secret programs, they all know that our theory of gravity is wrong and that MHD can explain everything without gravity. And I haven't seen any explanation of that. I haven't seen anybody work out that theory to show how that actually works out. I would love to see it, but so I'm kind of left right now with not knowing any more about that. Let me click on out more here. Chat save. Let's see. MHD is his theory of how continents move on a liquid mantle. When the EMF goes low enough, the physicality of the mantle changes from solid to liquid. How about Chan Thomas? I saw an article about Chan Thomas just the other day, and what it seemed to be saying is that his theory is not supported as well as the other model that I described about that the Antarctica, for example, if you look at the temperature changes that it's gone through, um, it does not seem to agree quite as well with his theory. But I'm not an expert on those theories, so I don't go too far on a limb on that. You know, so as far as the theories of the pole shift, I don't claim to be an expert on all the different models of the pole shift. It's enough to know that it does shift. But I've heard of Chan Thomas, but I don't. Right now, I'm not clear on whether the data is in on that or not. Whether it's been agreed to what the answer is. Okay.
Okay, so Barbara Samuelson is saying thank you.
Okay.
And I will echo that. Thank you very much, Claude.
Well, thank you all. It's a learning experience.
It's always very stimulating to listen to you.
Barry, you're from Paul. Would one nurse to shift? That's the same question we had, isn't it? The shift to another dimension or to a different time within our third dimension. Well, I mean, the way I think about it, I mean, is that it will, you will think you're in the same place you were in. Many things will look just the same, but there may be slight changes that you're in particles were in a different phase, and so some things will look different. So you could say it's a different time within our third dimension. I mean, but I mean, we our whole idea about our dimension, our universe, is based on our experience. We think of everything as being one thing, but if we have many realities all overlaid all at the same time, then it could be in another one. And one of the things I found, for example, in using this model, is that it's really helpful when you start studying the afterlife, when people describe what it's like to die, for example, or what it's like to enter one of the higher planes, one of the astral dimensions. They have to go through a process each time of becoming acclimatized by their frequency, adjusting their frequency, kind of getting it tuned in to be able to see clearly the people around them. They have to become synchronized with the reality around them before they're able to really perceive it. So we have a couple of really wonderful descriptions of people when they died, when the beings around them, they could only perceive a little bit at first, and the beings around them all seemed kind of stationary, and they only saw a few. But then as time went on, they become more tuned into it, and the other beings appeared to be alive, and they could see them moving now, and they can interact with them, and they can see the background much better. And so when you shift dimensions, it's almost like tuning a radio station in, that you may hear static at first, and then as you get it better and better tuned, it becomes clearer and clearer where you are, and then that becomes your reality, and this one fades away. So that's kind of how I think about it. And Paul says, you mentioned a massless electron in an early slide. What is that? Well, one of the pictures from physicists, and this is going back to Feynman, is that particles like electrons really, at the very smallest scale, should be massless. They don't really necessarily have a mass. And the mass is due to the energy of the electromagnetic field around them. And so they're constantly interacting with the field of the vacuum, which is knocking them back and forth. And that keeps them from going in any one direction very quickly. They kind of holds them in place and builds up this energy ball around them, and that's what is corresponding to their mass. I know that even in the old physics of the 19th century, if you calculate the mass of an electron based on the energy of its electric field, you get about 3/4 of what it should be if you put a cutoff in at a reasonable place. And the issue for physicists has always been trying to calculate the exact value of that mass and what's that due to, and it's still a question that they haven't really solved. But that's the idea behind it, is that mass is really due to the field. Paul says, thanks to you both. This all worked quite well. Thank you, Paul.
So if there's no other questions, I think it's time to end. So we will hopefully see you all or hear you, or see your questions, and you'll see us on June 19th. So,
well, thank you all. I really enjoyed this, and I'll keep practicing. Okay.
We'll both keep practicing. Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.